We've talked briefly about the log file. You can find errors and warnings in there. So we're going to go into a little bit more depth with that now. And I think to make that easy, I'm going to go to the screen share here. And talk about, first of all, debugging. So when it comes to debugging, first of all, you have to know that something went wrong. There's often some hints on the canvas. If the feature counts don't go all the way through, that's a pretty good indication that something's gone wrong. But usually, just taking a look at the log file, the first thing to look at, just along this top band here, are there any errors? Are there any warnings? Or at the very least, more warnings than usual. Remember, when you have feature caching turned on, it's going to give you about 10 warnings anyways. But if you suddenly see more, that's worth investigating. Another thing that you can look at is this line here in the log, translation was successful. Remember that, or just keep in mind that FME has a fairly broad interpretation of what successful means. Successful simply means that there were no errors that completely failed the translation. In this case, I have 58 warnings. It's entirely possible this translation was less than successful. Successful just means it got to the output. The features output, this count here can be useful if you are actually using writers. If you have something like a feature writer transformer, though, sometimes those don't necessarily show up as an output feature. So you can have a translation which is writing things out, and this stays at 0. So this isn't always diagnostic. What I would always look at is the errors and warnings. This is the most important part. So if you have a bunch of warnings, you can click on that to filter by them. Same thing with the errors. And generally speaking, the um, section that this warning or error is coming from will be available here. This column here, this is fairly new. If you're using an older version of FME Workbench, it might not have this just yet, but all of the newer releases of FME Workbench have this column. So I can click on this and it'll take me directly to this transformer. I can also read what the issue is. So you notice that I have a bunch of sort of sections in this log file now. When you see something like this is a feature dump. It is telling you there's something wrong with this feature and then telling you everything it knows about this feature. So we have the name of this. This is coming out through the expression evaluator output. And here are all of the attributes for this feature, including the format attributes, the coordinate system information, and some geometry information. So when you see something like this generally means that FME is pretty unhappy with this particular feature. And somewhere in here, it'll tell you why. We can see this in transformers. You can also see the same thing when you're writing out to some formats. For example, geodatabase. If you take a feature that has the wrong or a not allowed geometry and write that out to the geodatabase writer, with some of the writers, you get an error, translation quits. Some of the writers, you only get the warning. It's just going to tell you, hey, this feature type expects lines. You handed it a point. Here's all the information about the point. I'm going to skip this feature. So at the end of the translation, still says it's successful. It did write things out, but it didn't write that feature. So you can have features that just quietly disappear if you don't pay attention to the warnings. So this one's telling me null, missing, or empty string operand found in the expression. So I have a value of park distance, value of crime value, value of noise zone score. The final output's being set to null. So here, noise score zone has a value of 0. So that's that one there. That's fine. Park distance. That's fine. Where's the crime value? It looks like there is no attribute for crime value. So this indicates that something's not quite right in the translation. It's expecting a value for crime value. It's not getting it. There's a number of reasons why that could be. Could be that there was no crimes in that area. You would expect in that case that you would have a crime value attribute set to 0, but depending on how you're bringing the data in, it could be after a join, you don't have the attribute value at all. Nothing matched up to that particular street. It gets passed out. It doesn't have a crime value. So then you have to deal with that particular attribute value. So that's an example of locating the issue in the log file. Just click on these little links. It also gives you the name here so you can fish through it in your workspace, but really being able to click directly to it is really handy. Determining the problem, it'll be somewhere in there, and then figuring out what the solution is, that's going to take a little bit of work. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the kind of messages that we get here. Ultimately, there are four types of messages that show up in the log file. You don't see them named anything by default. So I'm going to skip ahead here to a setting here. I'm going to turn on my log timestamp information. It only shows up if you log the timestamp. Even then, hold on. I might need to rerun this. We'll see if that'll give us the names. It looks like we might not actually name them anymore in the log. So now we just have the types. Okay. So the four types of messages are error messages, indicating that something's gone really wrong and the translation is halted. Then we have the warnings. This is something you should be aware of. You should investigate, but it's probably okay. And then we have information lines. Information lines would be something like that. No, like that might be a statistic. Information line would probably be something like this. Point on area overlay. It's just telling you what FME is doing. Other information lines up the top here. We have the command line to run the workspace kind of information, starting the translation, the build version of this particular instance, the system time, what some of the environment variables are set at, what kind of license you have. This is using a floating license. It's going to expire. The machine name of your host, a bunch of information about your operating system, stuff like that. That's all information. And then we have statistics lines, stats lines, where it's telling you something about the number of features. So something like this. So it's processing a number of features. That would be a stats. So those are the four kinds. These would be stats as well. Those are the four kinds of entries in the log. Now, the contents of this log are also stored as a file. So if something goes wrong and you need to contact support, or something goes wrong and you come back to it later on and you're not sure what went wrong, you can always access the log file after the fact. This is also important if you're running FME from the command line. The log file is also in FME Flow. If you're running it in FME Flow, a log file is also stored there. To find the log file, go to the folder that contains the workspace. A quick and easy way to do that, right click on main here, and I can open up the containing folder. So here I see I have my workspace, I have the recovery file, and then I have the log file as well. And I can open this up. I'll open it up in Notepad++, and it contains all the same information. The log file itself will always contain the timestamp information. By default, the timestamp information is hidden or not displayed in the log window. But even if it's not showing up in the log window, it does show up in the log file. I'll talk more about the timestamp later. Here we can see the different log entry types. We have the inform, just giving you information. If I scroll down here, it'll start counting stuff. There's a stats one. So then we have the stats, that's counting numbers of features. And then we have the warns indicating, You should take a closer look at this. In this translation, nothing was so bad as to have an error, so the translation was considered successful. Now, when you do end up with warnings or errors, the features that cause that warning or error will be placed into an FFS file. The FFS file is the internal format of FME. This is the FME feature store format. This is our own format. This way you can investigate the data later after you've done the translation. So we have the log telling us something went wrong. This will allow us to inspect it. You can do that either by dragging that onto the inspector window, the visual preview window. Let's see if I can make that happen here. So I'll drag that on there. Select data set to view, FFS format. And then we can see the actual features that cause the problem. There's 3 of them. Notice that it doesn't have that crime count attribute at all. So that's an indication of what went wrong. Okay, so that is using the log file to identify problems. So please review that lesson. Yeah, it's a 5-minute one. It's top of the hour. I'll give you a 10-minute break. So we will continue at 11:15.